Which CPU is the true king of gaming? In this video, we are going to find out. My name is Matt, I'm a former rocket scientist, and my goal is to help you make the right component choices and put them together the right way every single time. In the UpcFC series, we've been helping you make the right choice by pitting two components against each other in the PC octagon to see who wins. In this video, our focus will be on the 4 top gaming CPUs from AMD and Intel to determine once and for all which CPU is the king of gaming. In addition to showing you benchmarks across 11 games, I'm also going to show you how your overall gaming experience can be impacted by CPU choice. And if you stick around, I'll share with you my pro tips for how to unleash performance locked inside each of these high-end CPUs, something you will definitely not want to miss. It's really not rocket science, so before the main event gets started, let's jump straight into demystifying gaming experience. CPU choice has a significant impact on your overall gaming experience. The CPU architecture you choose will inherently impact the performance you're able to achieve. If it's a monolithic design such as the 14900K, where all the cores, cache, and I/O are physically located on the same chip, then it will offer an advantage over chiplet or tile-based designs such as the 9800X3D and 285K, where different components are fabricated separately and then interconnected in a single package. Furthermore, the quality of the integrated memory controller, or IMC, which manages communication between the processor and system RAM, is also vitally important. There is a latency involved with how quickly the CPU can access data from RAM, and this latency is increased with chiplet or tile-based designs, which in turn will negatively impact game performance, especially in fast-paced games. This is where AMD's 3D V-cache technology can help. Every CPU has 3 levels of cache, with L1 cache being the smallest and fastest, L2 cache a little bigger and slower, and L3 cache the slowest and largest of them all. Each cache level is smaller in size but faster in speed, acting as a memory chain to your processor that can serve up instructions as they're needed. AMD's 3D V-cache is essentially just a larger secondary L3 cache that sits right on top of the CPU cores. L3 cache is much faster than system memory, which is why adding more of it can dramatically improve performance. By giving the processor access to such a large bank of additional temporary storage, it's able to store more information than it would normally have access to. This can make a large difference in games where some data needs to be repeatedly accessed. So if you want the best overall gaming experience, how do you figure out which CPU to buy? Most gamers use frame rate to measure the relative performance of CPUs, which is the number of frames displayed on screen per second, commonly abbreviated as FPS. However, what is actually being measured by in-game benchmark tools such as PresentMon and CapFrameX is the frame time, which is the time interval between individual images. Frame rate is simply 1 divided by the frame time, so once you measure the frame time, you can immediately calculate the frame rate. The 2 frame rates that most gamers look at are the average and 1% low FPS. The average FPS is simple to understand, however the 1% low FPS typically requires some explanation. For example, if a benchmark runs for 30 seconds and in that time generates 1000 frames, to calculate the 1% low FPS, the frame times for each frame get sorted from highest to lowest. Starting at the first frame, which is the highest frame time in the benchmark run, the frame time values are added until their sum reaches or exceeds 1% of the total benchmark time, which in this case is 300 milliseconds. The converted FPS value of the frame that reached or exceeded that 300 millisecond spot will be the 1% low FPS that is reported. These frame rates help show the relative performance between different components, but what they don't provide is a good feel for your overall gaming experience. To help solve this and provide gamers with a simple way to assess the quality of their overall gaming experience, I developed a new metric called the Gaming Quality Index, which consists of 2 main parts. In the first part, the 1% low FPS is compared against the widely accepted standard for good gameplay, which is 60 FPS. This allows you to directly measure the quality of your gameplay. If your 1% lows are above 60 FPS, then your overall gaming experience in that game will be good. If it's below 60 FPS, then your experience will suffer. So the first part of the equation defines the standard for what is a good gaming experience. The second part of the equation directly addresses stutter by calculating how much variability there is between your average and 1% low performance. An ideal gaming experience would result in your 1% lows being equal to your average FPS, which would mean there is essentially no variability in FPS as a function of time. If, however, there is a large difference between your average and 1% low FPS, then your gaming experience will suffer because you will notice frame rate spikes. So the second part of the equation penalizes components that offer inconsistent frame rate performance. So in this video, I am not only going to show you traditional performance metrics, but also the GQI to help provide you with a better feel for which CPU is able to offer a better overall gaming experience. As mentioned earlier, the battle today is between the 4 best gaming CPUs, with the AMD 9800 and 9950 X3Ds in the red corner, taking on the Intel 14900KS and 285K in the blue corner. The test systems being used to run the benchmarks are summarized in this table. I used high-end motherboards for each system, with the Hero and Apex being used for AMD and the Apex Encore and Unify X being used for Intel. I specifically selected 2DIMM motherboards for the Intel systems to enhance memory stability at higher speeds. Speaking of memory, to remove bias from the benchmarks, it's important to test all systems at their optimum memory conditions. For AMD AM5 based Ryzen CPUs, best performance is achieved with DDR5 8000 memory, as shown in my recent What's the Best Memory for AMD AM5 Ryzen X3D CPUs video. For Intel systems, performance scales directly with memory speed. So for the 14900KS, I used DDR5 8200 RAM, which is the fastest speed that I could get stable without pushing the voltages too high. For the 285K, I used DDR5 9000 QDIMM RAM, which is a higher speed you can run while remaining in Gear 2, which means the memory controller is running at half the RAM speed. Anything above 9000 megatransfers per second would force a switch to Gear 4, which in turn would negatively impact your performance. The remaining components were standardized across each system. An RTX 5090 Astral at default clocks was selected to place a high load on each CPU. I also used Thermal Grizzly graphene cryo sheets, and I applied a number of performance enhancing tweaks to each CPU, which will be covered in detail later in the video. In order to thoroughly test the CPUs, I ran the benchmarks at different graphic settings in addition to different resolutions. To place maximum load on each CPU, I tested at 1080p with low settings, which should allow me to extract max performance from each chip. To create a more balanced CPU-GPU load, I tested at 1440p with medium settings. And to see if each CPU had an impact on GPU performance, I tested at 4K with ultra settings. These resolution setting combinations align well with typical gamer selections, with 1440p medium settings reflecting what most online first-person shooter gamers would likely use to achieve maximum frame rates, whereas 4K ultra settings reflect what most single-player gamers would do with a high-end CPU-GPU combination to extract maximum quality. And finally, I added a new game to the benchmark suite, Marvel Rivals, which is a popular team-based third-person hero shooter that has a fantastic built-in benchmark. With the CPUs ready to go, let's check the benchmarks. But before we do, I think it's only appropriate to introduce this the right way. Over to you, Bruce.
And now, it's time! Introducing the components fighting for Blackbird PC Tech benchmark supremacy. In the blue corner, we have the champion. In the red corner, we have the challenger. Who will win this battle royale? Stay tuned to find out.
As you can see from the benchmarks, AMD was dominant at lower resolutions and graphics settings, while Intel was able to win at higher resolutions. So the question that I'm sure many of you are asking is, how do you unlock this level of performance? For my AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D, I was able to unlock max performance by making the following tweaks. 1. I set PBO to motherboard. 2. I set PBO scaler to 2x. 3. I set the max CPU boost clock override to plus 200 MHz. 4. I set a negative all-core curve offset of negative 35. 5. I turned Expo on, set CL to 36 and set the refresh interval to 65/535. And 6. I changed the Windows power plan to high performance. For my AMD Ryzen 9 9950X3D, I was able to unlock max performance by making the following tweaks. 1. I set the PBO to motherboard. 2. I set the PBO scaler to 2x. 3. I set the max CPU boost clock override to 150 MHz. 4. I set a negative curve offset of negative 25 for CCD0 and negative 30 for CCD1. 5. I turned Expo on, set CL to 36 and set the refresh interval to 65/535. And 6. I changed the Windows power plan to balanced. A comprehensive step-by-step guide for how to implement all of these tweaks and test for stability is contained within my What are the best settings for an AMD Ryzen CPU video. The impact of these tweaks on performance for the 9800X3D is summarized in this table. I used Cinebench R24 multi-core as the benchmark, and I turned on each tweak individually so I could show its impact on performance, starting with the smallest and ending in the largest. I then repeated this process for the 9950X3D. It's important to point out that many of these tweaks are synergistic. So although they may not appear to have an impact on performance when implemented individually, they do help improve performance when implemented together. In fact, when implemented together, the boost in performance is around 10% for the 9800X3D and 13% for the 9950X3D, with a decrease in latency of around 30%, which is exceptional. AMD's Ryzen 9 dual CCD X3D chips only have 3D V-cache on one of the two CCDs. Therefore, in order to extract max performance in games, the CCD with 3D V-cache needs to be prioritized over the CCD without. AMD relies on the Xbox Game Bar in Windows to help schedule and prioritize cores while gaming. Unfortunately, this approach doesn't always work well, with the non-X3D CCD being partially used in games, even when the CCD with 3D V-cache is not fully utilized. To help solve this problem, you can use a third-party tool like Process Lasso, which allows you to prioritize the X3D CCD while gaming, or you can use a feature like Turbo Game Mode in BIOS, which will shut down the second CCD and disable simultaneous multi-threading. By prioritizing the use of the X3D CCD and parking or disabling the other CCD, the latency will be reduced and the gaming performance will be improved. When you do this, a 9950X3D essentially becomes a 9800X3D for gaming. So you can simply look at the 9800X3D benchmarks to see what the 9950X3D is capable of when the CCDs are prioritized properly. That said, there was one game where the 9950X3D performance was significantly lower than the 9800X3D. In F1 2024, the 1% lows were terrible, especially at higher resolutions. So for that title, it made sense to enable Turbo Game Mode and rerun the benchmarks. At 1080p low, this actually reduced the performance, but at higher resolutions, the 1% lows increased significantly. For my Intel Core i9 14900KS, I was able to unlock max performance by making the following tweaks. 1. I set Asus Advanced OC Profile to multi-core enhancements, remove all limits 90 degrees Celsius. 2. I turned XMP on, set the CL to 38 and set VDD and VDDQ to 1.41 volts. 3. I set the DRAM refresh interval to 65/535. And 4. I changed the Windows power plan to high performance. A comprehensive step-by-step guide for how to implement all of these tweaks and test for stability is contained within my recent How to Tweak an Intel 14900K for Max Performance video. One important point worth noting is that I intentionally decided not to push the 14900KS further out of concern about the recent degradation issues experienced by higher-end Raptor Lake CPUs. For my Intel Core Ultra 9 285K, I was able to unlock max performance by making the following tweaks. 1. I set the P cores to 5.7 and 5.5 GHz. 2. I set E cores to 4.9 GHz. 3. I set the ring ratio to 4.0 GHz, NGU fabric to 3.4 GHz, and D2D interface to 3.6 GHz. 4. I set the performance preset in BIOS to MSI Extreme settings. 5. I turned XMP on, set CL to 40 and T-Refi to 65/535. And 6. I changed the Windows power plan to high performance. A comprehensive step-by-step guide for how to implement all of these tweaks and test for stability is contained within my recent How to Fix Intel Core Ultra CPU Performance video. The impact of these tweaks on performance for the 14900KS is summarized in this table. I again used Cinebench R24 multi-core as the benchmark, and I turned on each tweak individually so I could show its impact on performance, starting with the smallest and ending in the largest. I then repeated this process for the 285K. As I stated earlier, many of these tweaks are synergistic, so although they may not appear to have an impact on performance when implemented individually, they do help improve performance when implemented together. In fact, when implemented together, the boost in performance is around 9% for the 14900KS and 11% for the 285K, with a decrease in latency of over 30%, which is excellent. Intel Application Optimization, or APO, is a Windows 11 app that optimizes thread scheduling for select CPUs in select games. When the Core Ultra 200S series processors launched, Intel acknowledged that APO was not functioning correctly. After claiming that it was fixed in later firmware revisions, I decided to test it, but the results were extremely disappointing, which led me to conclude that it wasn't a tool that I could recommend using at that time. Fast forward to September of 2025, when Intel suddenly decided to publish an update for APO, the first update for the year. Given this, I decided to retest to see if Intel had finally fixed the issues. As you can see from the updated Total War Warhammer III results, I'm glad I did. By simply turning APO on, I was able to more than double the 1% lows at every resolution, which is amazing. Unfortunately, this was somewhat of an anomaly for the 285K, with other games not showing any meaningful difference, as shown in Cyberpunk 2077. For the 14900KS, in addition to testing with APO turned on, I also decided to test with the E-cores turned off, but what I found is that it's much better to use APO. The performance increases with APO turned on are not as profound as with the 285K, but they are still meaningful. As you can see, turning the E-cores off only appeared to be beneficial with the CPU under a heavy load, with the performance tanking at higher resolutions. This is consistent with what I found when testing a 14900K against a 9950X in an earlier video. Given that APO works at all resolutions, it makes more sense to use it instead of turning the E-cores off. In fact, for the 14900KS, I found that it was beneficial to use APO in 8 of the 11 games that I tested, whereas for the 285K, it was helpful in 5. In this video, we pitted the 4 best gaming CPUs against each other in the PC octagon to see who will emerge victorious, with the 9800 and 9950X3Ds in the red corner, taking on the 14900KS and 285K in the blue corner. The round-by-round results show a narrow victory for AMD, with the 9800 and 9950X3D winning 52% of the benchmarks. When you look at the performance across 11 games, it becomes clear that AMD does particularly well at lower resolutions and graphics settings, where the load on the CPU is highest. This is the right way to test the relative performance of CPUs, and these results align with the general consensus from other reviewers, even though the magnitudes are much smaller. At higher resolutions, however, where the load shifts to the GPU, it's actually Intel that is able to offer better performance, with the 285K delivering exceptional 1% load performance. This is likely attributable to the extra L3 cache on the X3D chips becoming fully saturated at 4K, resulting in the need to access system RAM more frequently, which therefore favors the faster RAM on Intel CPUs. This is an impressive result for the 285K and shows the true potential of this chip when configured properly. If we now look at gameplay experience, it's actually Intel that takes a narrow victory, with the 14900KS and 285K winning 53% of the benchmarks. What's truly fascinating is that there are a number of instances highlighted in yellow where the performance winner was not the same as the gameplay winner. This shows the importance of considering both when selecting a CPU. In fact, when you look at the average gameplay experience across 11 games, it becomes clear that Intel is able to compete much more effectively than the performance numbers alone would suggest. Even at lower resolutions and graphic settings where AMD dominates, the 14900KS is only 5% behind, which is remarkable given the age of this platform. If we now look at professional workloads such as Blender and 7-Zip, the 9950X3D is a clear winner with advantages of over 10%. In fact, this advantage extends to AI-related workloads as well, an area that is rapidly growing in popularity. It's not all bad news for Intel, however, as the 285K offers significant improvements in efficiency, beating the 9950X3D in 3D Mark CPU profile and time spy while losing to it in Cinebench. Not too bad given how incredible incredibly inefficient the 14900KS is. But what happens when we look at cost? The 9800X3D is currently selling for $480, which is approximately $100 less than the 285K and around $220 less than the 9950X3D and 14900KS. However, if you add in the cost of RAM, then the 285K platform becomes the most expensive option tested. This is due to the recent spike in RAM prices, with the DDR5 9000 CUDA memory that I use for the 285K nearly doubling in price, making it around 11% more than the 14900KS, 14% more than the 9950X3D, and a whopping 47% more than the 9800X3D system that I use for testing. If you now convert these platform costs into gaming value or FPS per dollar at 1080p, then the 9800X3D platform is a clear winner, offering significantly higher value in gaming. This doesn't really change if we look at 4K, with the 9800X3D still able to deliver exceptional value. If we look at value versus price at 1080p, it's clear that the 9800X3D is still in a league of its own when it comes to delivering exceptional gaming value. At 4K, however, the Intel CPUs are able to offer better value trend lines, but at current prices, they are simply too expensive to compete directly with the 9800X3D, at least when it comes to gaming. With that said, these results do offer up some interesting choices. On the one hand, if you're building a new PC with a heavy focus on gaming, then based on these results, it's hard to pass up the value delivered by the 9800X3D. You can even pair it with cheaper motherboards and RAM and still extract similar performance. However, if you're gaming at 4K with all of your graphic settings maxed out and you want the very best gaming experience money can buy, then the 285K would be the way to go. You will need to buy high-end RAM to extract the most out of it, but when properly tuned, it will provide excellent performance. And if you're using your PC for tasks other than gaming, then both the 9950X3D and 285K are great options to consider. What that will really come down to is the software that you use. Some professional applications will run better on Intel, while others will run better on AMD. So which CPU is the true king of gaming? Based on the data presented in this video, which shows max performance for each platform, it's clear that the 9800X3D is the current king of gaming. When each CPU is heavily loaded, the 9800X3D delivers outstanding performance combined with an unmatched gaming experience. However, it's not as dominant as the mainstream tech channels would have you believe, with the 285K winning the battle in GPU-bound scenarios. The good news is that all of these CPUs will deliver an excellent gaming experience regardless of how you play. So what you choose will likely come down to how you prioritize other factors such as power efficiency, price, and future upgradability. While AMD did manage to win this battle and cement the 9800X3D as the true king of gaming, my hope is that this video will once and for all dispel the myth that Intel is not a worthy competitor, because consumers actually do have great options to choose from. Remember, it's not rocket science, it's Lego. My goal is to help you make the right component choices and put them together the right way every single time. Thank you for watching this video in the Ultimate PC Component Fighting Championship Battle Series. If you enjoyed today's video, please hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes as other components battle it out in the PC Octagon. And if you'd like to support the channel further and gain access to some really great perks such as live Q&A sessions, please also consider joining our new school community. Bye for now.